Hey, everybody. So, as the coronavirus situation is transforming society, um, I want to discuss something that I keep hearing about, like on Joe Rogan's podcast. For example, he keeps talking about moving out of LA, moving out of the cities. He had on Greg Fitzsimmons the other day, and once again, he talked about he has mentioned before how he likes being out in the country and how he's thought about moving out there or moving out of LA, especially since this coronavirus situation. And one thing that Rogan talked about was homesteading. And before I get into that, talking about more self reliance. And that is one thing that people, I think we're all getting a lesson in this whole coronavirus situation is self-reliance. Many people are realizing that they need to be more self-reliant. So they need to have food, they need to have backup supplies, things like that in case of any kind of emergency happens. And Rogan also brought up the interesting point of how not only is our civilization so fragile, but this shit hasn't been around very long. The idea of these huge centralized cities where food comes from way, way far away and is trucked in and flown in and from these central hubs around the country and the world, and everybody's living on these electric grids. Like, this isn't the normal default of humanity. Like, yes, humanity has had big cities for a long time. But I bet if you dig in to those places, you'll find that there were food sources very close to the city. Probably many people had gardens. Many people had, various types of animals, like maybe chickens, maybe some kind of small way that you can have food close to home. But in our current environment, most of our food comes from all over the place. If, for example, I'm in Houston and the Houston area, so, we don't get all of our food from Houston countryside. We don't get all of our food from Texas. We get food from things that are, vegetables and fruits from Mexico, South America. Probably we get corn from the middle of the country and soybeans from all over the place. And, all of our food products are made in these centralized hubs all throughout the country, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, which makes us very vulnerable to all kinds of supply chain issues. Supply chain has really been a buzzword in this coronavirus situation because people have talked about whether or not our supply chains will be sufficient to take care of our food needs. And what I find very significant about one reason I talk about how Joe Rogan is discussing this issue, the reason I bring that up is because Rogan is a significant player in media. And when he talks about something like, hey, this isn't the way that human beings live, or hey, like this shows you how vulnerable we are, you can bet your ass hundreds and millions of people, maybe not hundreds of millions, but probably millions of people are going to be hearing this. And they're going to be saying, yeah, that's true. I should have food closer to home. I should create a garden. I should create, hey, I have a backyard. Can I get some chickens? It's funny. I was in a suburban area. I'm in a suburban area now, but I was in a suburban area a little further away from where I am currently, and there was somebody that had chickens there. I would go for a run, kind of explore the area, and somebody had chickens in their backyard. And I remember at the time I thought that was kind of funny. I hadn't really thought about it. I was like, why the hell would they have chickens? But then, Rogan talks about how he has chickens. And, he doesn't have any now, but how being able to have your own eggs, having a garden where you can at least have something, maybe some tomatoes, maybe some onions, something of that kind of thing, could be really beneficial in some kind of food crisis. And I've said before, people need, going forward, you might not live in an area that is good for having chickens or for raising whatever the hell to eat or for having a really robust garden. But hey, everyone should have a backup supply of food. Everyone should be able to defend themselves as well. Now, I want to go ahead and transition a little bit over to an idea that I mentioned earlier, which was homesteading. So, homesteading is, from what I understand, is moving out into the country. Maybe you go by yourself, maybe with a small group of people. You don't all live together, but you guys kind of form a small community, and you try to live off the land. So maybe you do some domestic farming, you do some, maybe some farming, maybe some raising of some animals, things like that, in order to be self-sufficient. It's about self-sufficiency. And that's what I think this crisis has shown to us, is that we all need to be more self-sufficient. So real quick here, let me Google homesteading. Homesteading, what is the exact destination or definition? Homesteading. Yeah, okay. Homesteading is a lifestyle of self-sufficiency. It is characterized by subsistence agriculture, home preservation of food, and may also involve small-scale production of textiles, clothing, and craft work for household use or sale. So, there's a guy on Twitter named Joe Norman who is homesteading. He has a PhD. He seems to do a lot of work in applied complexity theory. Complexity is something I'm learning about more and more now, thanks to Nassim Taleb, Yanir Bar-Yam, and Joe Norman. These are the guys that called out they're not the only guys, but they are some of the people who recognized the potential threat of this virus from the beginning. And they have a pretty good idea of how complex systems interact. So how one problem in one part of the world, due to the interconnectedness of the world, can cause a cascading effect of failures and issues around the world in other unimaginable ways. And this guy, Joe Norman, has been homesteading, and he has a really interesting document I kind of wanted to talk about, which is not about homesteading per se, but it's about the issues with decentralization. And this has to do with self-sufficiency, is what I'm talking about. Decentralization, more localized action across the economy in the world, seems to be a potential remedy for another kind of virus situation or another kind of viral outbreak, or any kind of big systemic issue. So what do I mean by that? Decentralization has to do with bringing food production, manufacturing, and things like that to as local a level as possible. So that means within the United States, within your state, within your county, within your city. So yes, of course, you continue to get food from outside, you continue to get products from outside of other places, but to become less reliant on those things. That's the idea. So let's dive into that a little bit. He's got a paper. I want to go through some of the ideas in it. So I'll be right back after this break. All right, so let's get back into it. So there's a paper by Joe Norman, and it says it's called Global Decentralization for Risk Mitigation and Security. So it's about, being able to stop or to slow risk down and increase security through decentralization. So he starts off, the outbreak of a novel coronavirus we are facing is poised to become a global pandemic. So this is back February 14th. If current approaches to stemming its spread prove to be insufficient, while we can't yet say what the ultimate impact of this event will be, this crisis and government's responses to it reveal vulnerabilities and fragilities in the structure of our global socioeconomic milieu. So he says there are two interrelated issues of connectivity that produce global fragility. So remember, fragility. Global fragility is this idea that it doesn't take a lot to break you. It's just like, some kind of nice porcelain cup or a piece of glass. It's fragile. If it's exposed to a little bit of volatility, then it will break. So he's talking about global fragility. It's like what we're seeing now. Our system is so fragile that we are not able to even slow or stop the spread of a virus without it potentially breaking our economic system. So he says there are two interrelated issues that produce global fragility: long-range physical connectivity that generates a connected network with large hubs in short internode distances, and then global centralization of essential functional roles made possible by long-range physical and informational connectivity. So first off, he's talking about physical connectivity. So the way that this can be looked at is through like air travel, and also, you can look at it through cars, trains, things like that, where somebody in one part of the world, like I can get to Taiwan in less time on a plane than it takes me to drive to places in the United States. And those places in the United States are physically closer, but from a functional standpoint, they're really not that much closer. In fact, they might even be farther depending on how I decide to get there. And so all these places that were far, far away, we are now super close to each other. And so this has created a risky situation for sicknesses, for viruses. Nassim Taleb talked about this back in, I think, 2010. There have been quotes of him going around. He said he wrote about it in one of his books. I can't remember if it was Fooled by Randomness or Anti-Fragility or Anti-Fragile, where he discussed the idea of a virus hopping on a plane and moving around the world and causing, mass problems for people. And now it just seems obvious. So, Joe Norman continues, high mortality pathogens that would otherwise cause local extinction and prevent their own system-wide spread have no effective buffer in small world systems. So because of travel and interconnectivity, the world is smaller, right? Like I said, I can get to Taiwan in the same amount of time it takes me to drive to parts of the United States. So sicknesses, it's very interesting. We can look at Wuhan, for example. What happened in Wuhan if it was 200, 300 years ago, it would have stayed in Wuhan. Or it might have gone out into the broader provinces, but it would have moved much slower. It would have not gone across the world, probably. Or if it went across the world, it probably would have taken a long time, probably would not have been nearly as deadly. Now, of course, we know about the Black Plague in Europe, but it takes longer for things like this to spread whenever you have whenever things aren't so interconnected. Now, we can bring up maybe a refutation about this. Well, look, the Black Plague was back in the day, but it's like, yes, the Black Plague was back in a less connected era. That's true. But also with our level of technology today, we know things that they didn't know back then. So if you're able to combine localism, or basically people being able to disconnect from the network whenever a virus starts to spread, you should be able to control that a lot better. We can monitor these things a lot better now. I mean, I even read an article today about how in Sweden they can test the sewage to see different viruses that are emerging in their society. Now, next, Joe Norman talks about global centralization of function and implications. So the political and economic mechanisms, I'm reading the conclusion of this paragraph pretty much. The vision of a global system in which central hubs uniquely serve particular functions is a direct analog of what we observe in complex multicellular organisms. Particular and localized organ systems serve essential functions for the entire body. So what he's talking about is how, for example, China manufactures like almost all of the PPE, all of the personal protective equipment. Or like America might make all of a certain kind of crop, or have all of a certain type of technology. Or how I think it was Puerto Rico, was making all of the blood IV bags. So if you centralize due to efficiency gains, if you centralize all the production of a particular good in one in one geographic area, then the failure of that geographic area has a similar effect to the failure of an organ system in the human body. Because the human body, if, for example, if my heart fails, I die. If my liver fails, I die, right? Now, of course, there are some that have multiple locations like the kidney, but that's, if there are multiple systems in the human body that if one of them goes down, your entire body fails. That's what Joe Norman's making the comparison to, that our global world system is being set up like one human body. So that way, if one part of the system fails, everyone goes down. If we wish for the global human system to avoid such a fate, we must encourage and insist on functional redundancy and a vision of the globe as an ecosystem of organisms rather than an organism itself. Okay, so he's talking about how we need to figure out a way to reorganize or at least to make more redundancies. So instead of having one part of the human body for the heart, say for example, if China is a manufacturing hub of the world, so we need to change that. China cannot be the only manufacturing hub of the world. We need redundancies. So we, instead of having one heart on earth for humanity, we need multiple hearts. We need multiple livers. We need more than 2 lungs. We need 4, 6 lungs. We need 4 to 6 kidneys, right? We need these essential places to have multiple areas where they can exist. So that way humanity is not taken out by one event that takes out the heart or that takes out the liver or that takes out, whatever other, takes out the brain, right? You don't want America to be the only place. You don't want everyone to only rely on American or Chinese technology, right? You don't want all that to only rely on U.S. technology or U.S. networks or U.S. this. Now, don't get me wrong. I think it's great for U.S. economy, but it's not good for the world if everyone only relies on us, right? Or we have to have more redundant systems in order to survive these shocks like we're seeing now. Next, he talks about spatial trade strategy and adaptive decoupling. It is clear that if we choose to generate and maintain global flows of travelers and supply chains, we must also have a tolerance for temporary disconnection of long-range connections in the interest of preventing local contagion cascades that show the potential for severe harm from becoming global and systematic. This puts considerable constraint on, what is the next part? I can't see what the next part of it is, but anyway, he's talking about how if we do decide to continue to be as globalized as we are, we're going to have to accept the fact that these situations can happen, and we're going to have to plan for those accordingly. So we need to have ways in place for people to disconnect and not be the end of the world. This is something that I became very frustrated with as this situation emerged, because I started seeing very, very smart people, but smart in their fields, right? Like politics, economics, real estate investing, that were losing their minds over the shutdowns. They're like, look, you're going to crash the economy. You're going to crash the economy. Now, one thing to keep in mind, some people who talk about crashing the economy, their money, like their wealth is in these systems that are going down, right? Some of us don't have a lot of wealth. I don't have hardly any wealth at all. Most people I know have no wealth. So this whole idea of a shutdown isn't as big a deal. It's about survival, right? I mean, most people in the United States, it's just about survival. It's not about, oh, my stocks are going down, unless, of course, you're a boomer who's going to retire. But, in which case you might have all your money in the stock market in your 401k, which is not good that it goes down. But anyway, listening to these people talk about, oh, you're going to crash the economy. I'm thinking, okay, yes, I get it. We have to deal with this situation, that the economy is going to face a difficult situation. We have to look at this in a nuanced way. But at the same time, it seemed like a death sentence for humanity if we are not able, if every time a cantigen comes around, we have to stop and say, let's look at the data first before we proceed, then one day we are going to lose. One day we are going to be as fucked as the Europeans in the Black Plague, because we're going to be going, oh, well, we have to wait for the data first. Well, if you wait for the data for too long, then the situation has already spread out of control. And there are people that I highly respect on Twitter for certain capacities that are super data-driven people that are like, look, I was right. We shouldn't have had the shutdowns, but I got all the data first. And it's like, look. I understand what you're saying. You're a smart person. There are some very intelligent people that are like, we need to look at data first. I get that. But in a life or death situation, you don't have time to collect all the data. If you've ever been in a sparring match, if you've ever been kickboxing, boxing, jiu-jitsu, anything like that, you'll know you don't have the benefit of complete information. You don't know what your opponent is going to do to you when you do your next move. You don't know what they're going to do next. You have to constantly act in a situation of having incomplete data, incomplete information. You don't exactly know what's going to happen, but you have to make a move anyway. This is how this pandemic situation is playing out. It's like a fog of war. It's like a competition. It's like a fight. It's survival in the wilderness. Humanity has found itself in the wilderness with this virus. It's almost as though we thought it's like having a civilization and you being like, oh, I know how the civilization runs. And then you take a left turn down a street that you thought you were familiar with and you're in the forest. And now you're like, holy shit, how do I survive? Well, guess what? If you're waiting for all the complete data about the forest to figure out where every potential enemy is, where every potential, hostile animal is, you're going to die. And it's a good example of don't follow the leaders who are only sitting around and waiting for data. Yes, you have to act on the data you have, but if you wait too long, then you will also be killed. And that is the situation with this virus. This time around, it looks like we're going to be lucky, right? That's how it looks to me. This time around, we're lucky. This virus if it was going to eliminate, if it was really going to kick our asses, it would already have done it because we haven't taken it seriously. So we're going to be lucky, I think, with this one, even though people are going to die. Of course, people are going to be hurt from this, but it's not an extinction level event. Now, at least that's how it seems. So going forward, we have to figure out a way to deal with this. And it looks like we either have to become more localized in the way that we deal with our economics, so manufacturing, supply chains, food, all of that. And or we're going to have to become better able to disconnect from the global supply chain without everybody being destroyed. So that would mean everybody having a pandemic food supply, everybody having pandemic water supply, everybody having a pandemic savings account, right? Everybody having, some form or fashion to survive. All right, that's all I got for today. You can go to my website, tstuch.com, tstuch.com. Follow me on YouTube, Taylor Space Stutch. Twitter is fire, tstuch1. Thank you for listening. Hey, everybody, welcome back. In this episode, I'm going to talk about a few major things, a few important details here. We're going to discuss some things that Joe Rogan's been talking about. He's been increasingly discussing the idea of people getting out of cities, especially himself and some of his friends. And he brought up homesteading. So I'm going to talk a little bit about homesteading. Then we're going to move into the future. What are some options for the future? We're going to look at Joe Norman wrote a paper. We're going to talk about that. Decentralization, decoupling. What does all of this mean? Is the world like a multiple organisms, or is it like one organism? And how does that change the future? How does that change our calculations for the future? Anyway, thank you for listening. Enjoy the episode. Oh, you can go to my website, tstuch.com, tstuch.com. You can follow me on YouTube, Taylor Space Stutch. And you can follow me on Twitter, TeaseTouch1.